Hey out there, this is Kevin with Custom Micro. The other day we did a review of an FS.com switch. Today we're going to do a walkthrough of the graphical user interface. Let's do it. The default IP address of the switch is 192.168.1.1. So for your initial configuration, you'll need to set the IP address of your computer to match that same subnet. Maybe make it 192.168.1.10 or something along those lines. And then you'll be able to log into the web interface. When you get to the login screen, the default username and password are lowercase admin. So you'll enter your username and password and log in. Now I recommend you change your password, but there's another thing we need to talk about first. By default, the password of this switch is stored in the config file in plain text. But the good news is there is a command you can run that will change it to where your password is encrypted. We will talk about that more in our video walkthrough of the command line interface, so stay tuned for that. But continuing on into our walkthrough of the web interface of the S5500-48T6SP-R, when you log in, you'll notice at the very top we have the model of the switch, we have our different language selections. The important things are over here. We have a port panel, which is really nice. We can see what interfaces are actually active, and we can see some details. If I hover over that, it shows the MAC address of the device that's there. It shows the speed, link speed, and duplex, and that could be very handy if you want to see it in a graphical representation. We also have save all. It's very important. You might attribute this to something similar to when you commit changes from the command line. Whatever changes you make in the web interface, they do not immediately go into effect. You have to come up here and click Save All, so do not forget to do that. In fact, we'll try this in a little bit, but it pops up a warning telling you to do so. And then of course you have your About, and then you can log out of the switch. Now when you log in, you start off underneath Device Status in the Device Info page. It tells you important things like your BIOS version, firmware version, the serial number, MAC address, etc. of the switch. We can see the IP address that we're currently using on the switch. And some other helpful things, your uptime, CPU usage, and memory usage. We go to the next tab over, we've got Interface State, and we can see in a glance, which is really nice, the interfaces, their description. Currently we have no descriptions on these, whether they're enabled or disabled, their connection state, their MAC address, speed, duplex, and then some interesting things that could be useful to you. But you can see how much data has been transferred in and out of that port, that interface. And then we see our flow control. We go here to the next tab down. It looks almost identical. And again, this just gives you more analytics about packets that have been sent and received. But this can be very helpful if you're troubleshooting maybe a faulty cable, maybe a poor signal on one of your transceivers, because you'll be able to see if there's been some packets discarded. It might indicate that you have a physical link issue. So this could be a very helpful screen underneath the device status interface flow. Then we have a MAC address table. We've got, tells us what VLAN we're on, tells us the MAC address of our network adapter that's connected, and it tells it if it's static or dynamic, and then it tells you what port you're connected to. So my laptop at this time is connected to port 1. Now one thing that's, to me, that is maybe something if I was to have a process improvement, I'd like to see the IP address listed on this MAC address table. And so FS, if you're watching this, that would be a great feature to add here. That's when I go to a MAC table, that's typically what I'm looking for. I want to match up a MAC address with an IP address with a port number. And then we have some logging we can look at here. You can search through the logs. I like how you can search and drill down to a certain time on a certain day and look at logs. We have some very useful information about our optics. So as was mentioned in the unboxing video, and by the way, if you've not seen that, please subscribe to our channel so you can be notified every time we go live with a new video. On that video, we talked about this is a unique switch in that it has 6 10 gig SFP plus ports. And so a lot of switches of this caliber in this kind of in the same league as the switch would only have 4, so that's quite an advantage. But what I love on this, a lot of times you have to go to the command line to get telemetry for your transceivers. In this case, however, it's right here in the graphical interface, so that's a really nice touch. Right now I just have a 10 gig, 10 kilometer single mode transceiver plugged in, and here's the information. We see our transmit and receive power. The reason it looks the way it does is because currently there's no optics plugged into this transceiver. We see the temperature, voltage, and bias. And this is going to be very helpful in troubleshooting issues. Maybe you've got a fiber that's air gapped, maybe you've got a dirty fiber connection. You'll be able to tell at a glance some of those problematic connections, maybe tell you why you're having some intermittent problems. So this is a very nice touch. That kind of rounds out the device status tab. I'm going to go ahead and kind of go down to the next one, which is our basic config. Underneath there, it is truly basic, as in we can set the host name of the switch, and then we can also set your clock management. I would encourage you to use a time server. It's now some of you may have a time server on-prem, or maybe you just go out and use pool.ntp.org or some other, but I would suggest you set this up because this is going to be of much importance whenever you're looking at your logs. You don't want your logs to look like they came from 1970. In fact, they're not going to say that, but you notice it says right now our system time is almost 2,100 hours, and it says it's January 1st, 2000. So it looks like we made it past Y2K, woo! But not much farther. So I would encourage you to get all that set up, and it will definitely help when you're looking through your logs. Under port configuration, we have port description, very helpful. Let's say you got an IP camera, maybe you have some other device plugged in, maybe an IP phone. You can set descriptions here, and I would encourage you to do that, especially with a 48 port switch. It's one thing to label your patch cables going into the switch, but having it labeled inside the switch can make a world of difference. When somebody says, hey, this access point's messing up, you can go back and look and say, oh, the access point's in port 16. So I'd encourage you to label things when you're doing your project, when you start the project. Under port config, all the normal things you would expect to see. You can enable or disable the port. You can set the speed to 10, 100, or auto. Of course, auto is going to, try to connect at gigabit if possible on the first 48 ports of the switch. Your duplex, full, half, or auto, and then your flow control. Now, I will say, typically, and here it is, the year 2022, it's normally safe to leave speed and duplex both set to auto, but occasionally if you're plugging into an older Cisco switch or something, you may have to set the speed to, especially the duplex, maybe to full as opposed to auto. We can't manually set it to gigabit, which is interesting. So you'll just have to leave that to auto and hope that everything links up okay. And then moving along, we have rate limit. Again, this is quite an interesting thing. I would say this is one of the top tier features of this switch, is the fact that you can actually limit your send and receive speed or per interface. Very unique, very interesting. Certainly a feature that I would think is a great selling point for this switch. To give you an example, it's common for your wireless access points through the controller for those to allow you to, in essence, set these speed limits to, let's say, a guest network, for example. And you could say, I want my guest on my Wi-Fi to be able to download or have a download speed more than 8 megabit per second and an upload more than 1 megabit per second. You can easily do that in most wireless controllers today, but now we can set it at the switch level for every individual interface, and we can set a receive and a send kind of speed limit, if you will. And so definitely a nice touch. Props to FS for including that right there in the graphical interface, mind you. So then we have port mirroring. Again, that might be useful to you for different various things. This particularly could be helpful for logging, maybe some Wireshark type stuff you're trying to do, troubleshoot some networking problems. Just mirror the receive transmit traffic from a particular interface out another interface, capture that with Wireshark, and you can tell what's going on. Could be a handy feature for troubleshooting. kind of have your watchdog timer, if you want to call it that, but kind of your keep alive detection, some things like that. You can enable that for your ports. And I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work, but my assumption would be if maybe it detects the ports down, it might try to restart that port, disable, re-enable it, try to get it back up. But you can definitely tinker around with that setting and see what it's all about. Some port filtering, and while we're on this particular tab, I'll mention something that's very important about the switch, and you can definitely miss it. Another process improvement for FS, if you could make this bar right below the main bar of the menu, make this a different color, because you'll notice we actually have two different tabs underneath the port filter configuration selection. The first one of those just lets you enable or disable port filtering and filtering DHCP and other things, and then you can enable or disable that different filtering options per interface. And so just keep in mind, a lot of these menu selections on the left will have multiple tabs up here at the top, so you could easily miss those if you're not looking for them. So maybe if there's a setting you're looking for under, let's say when we get to it, DHCP, and you're like, I know there should be another menu somewhere to round this out, it's probably there. You just have to go to the different tab. Loopback detection could be very important. Make sure you have stability of your network. If you're concerned about somebody just plugging in something and creating a loop on your network, you do have loopback detection you can enable. Of course, port security, again, another menu where you've got a lot of options here, and you just can look along the top bar here to see your different menu options. And you can pause this video at any time to take a look more closely at these different menu options if they're helpful to you. Obviously today, security is of paramount importance, and you do have a lot of port security options there. Of course, you have your storm control, which is nice. Believe it or not, this might be more common than you realize, especially if you have spanning tree enabled throughout a good part of your network. If something's not configured just right, maybe one particular switch is set to be the master, has the lowest kind of number set to it. Sometimes they can begin to fight over that, and you can end up, even if you don't actually have a loop on the network, or maybe if the loop has even been repaired, you can still have a broadcast storm. And so you can set some thresholds here to kind of put the next to that if you have too many packets being sent, because that'd be very helpful. And so some of these things maybe a little bit, I'm not sure, I haven't had time to dive in and do a deep dive into every single setting in the switch, but this is called Port Protect Group Config. Probably ways to group some of these things together and make it a little bit easier. Like, for example, we could add a group here. It potentially makes it where you don't have to go in and manually set every single interface. You can actually group some of that together, which could be helpful. And then we have PoE Global Real-Time Info. I think that's very handy to have. We've got our total power, usage threshold, alarm power, and we've got temperature and all those things related to power over Ethernet. We have our PoE info list. So you can set a max wattage per port, which is very handy. It is in milliwatts, so keep that in mind. So for example, this will be a 30 watt max that's currently set kind of by default on that port. And you can force the connection. I would say, if I'm understanding what that probably means correctly, be careful with that setting, because if you were to force PoE on a port and then you plug something in that does not require PoE, it could potentially burn out that device, so be careful with that. That may be more for a device that's a passive PoE type device. It's not 802.11 AF or AT standard. The device doesn't seem to, the switch can't detect it properly, and it doesn't know to supply PoE power. So just keep that in mind. It could be handy if you got a passive PoE device, but be very, very careful with that. Definitely label that port. And so you notice we have some current power. This is kind of like your real time of what's going on with these. Should have went ahead and plugged in a PoE device for the video, for the sake of the video, but I think you can easily see that. This is very handy. If you're curious about the PoE budget of the switch, go back and watch our unboxing video. There's a difference between if both power supplies are running and plugged in, or if you're just running on a single power supply. Your power budget for PoE is quite a bit different there. But it's ample amount of, for really, you could probably have nearly some sort of PoE device in every port and probably still be under budget for most devices nowadays, like your voice over IP phones, your IP cameras, things of that nature. Now, some of the higher end PTZ cameras may require more wattage, and there's certainly some other networking devices, some of those PoE extender type devices, where you have maybe a 4-port switch that's actually powered over Ethernet. Those are going to require more wattage, so keep that in mind. And so very, very cool. I like how they've really laid out a lot of these menus, and they've given you a lot of useful information right here in the, over the last number of years, I typically live in the command line when I'm configuring switches, but to be able to go here and see things like my transceiver information, my transmit receive power, to be able to see things like, PoE budget and all that right here in a graphical representation. That's something I would and will use. This switch is going to be deployed in a production environment soon. We've covered a lot of ground so far in part 1. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll cover layer 2 config, layer 3 config. There's a lot of options in there. This is a very robust switch, a lot of features, feature rich. So I think you'll enjoy that, so stay tuned. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment down below.